One. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Night Drive West Suburban podcast. This is Josh Welge. I'm here with Joel Boenitz. And Joel, we made it through week one, a very exciting week one across Illinois, across the western suburbs. A lot of great football that we were able to see, that we were able to hear about, that we were able to read about, and hopefully the people out there were able to read about. Thank you for your support. Joel, how was it for you, your first experience of Illinois high school football?
Yeah, I mean, what a wild week of high school football all around. You saw a lot of different games happening. You saw some with some explosive defenses or explosive offenses. You had defensive showdowns, and then you have games that are decided within the final drive. I mean, an absolutely insane first week of high school football here in Illinois.
Yeah, it really was. It's really, really fun. And it's one of those that, boy, you just wait forever. It's kind of like Christmas. You just can't wait for it to get here. And then it's finally there and it lives up to your expectations. So it was a great week. But the best part about it is we're just getting started. Um, as we tape here on Tuesday afternoon, again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you're just joining us, we have on Tuesday our Friday Night Drive updated power rankings just dropped this morning. Spoiler alert, there's a new number one, and there's a few teams that have joined the top 25 that are from the western suburbs. So take a look at that. You can look at Steve Sousie's, kind of what we learned from week one. On Wednesday, Steve will be dropping his next playoff projections. They'll be coming every week, so definitely take a look at that. We also have notebooks and features for pretty much every market on our Shaw footprint, all the way from the western suburbs to the Mississippi River. So definitely check it out. Joel, like we said, a lot of great games last weekend. I'm going to start at the game that I was at on Saturday and kind of work our way back. Batavia at Glenbard West. That's a matchup that it's funny. I was kind of wondering, had those programs ever played each other, because they're two of the best programs in the western suburbs. You can maybe make a case that they are the two best programs in the western suburb. And I talked to Glenbard West coach Chad Hetlett, and he said they've never played each other, at least as long as he and Dennis Piron, the Batavia coach, have been there. And between the two of them, we're talking about a combined about 30 years on the sidelines at those schools. So he's and Coach Hetlett said, we always wanted to play each other before we were, and the way he worded, as we get closer to retirement. And I don't think of those guys as anywhere near retirement, but anyway, it was good to see them get together and a good game. It was a game that Batavia, they led the whole way. They felt like they were in control, but they never were able to really kind of put away Glenbard West until the final minutes. They finally come out with a 35-28 win. And really the story for Batavia is, we talked about it before, they graduated some significant pieces of their offense with Ryan Bowe, their quarterback, receiver. They just lost a lot of talent. Batavia's been a team offensively that in the past, they've really liked to spread the wealth, and different guys get the ball and kind of move it around, and they pass and they run. And they were not that on last Saturday. They were like, we're going to give the ball to Nathan Whitwell over and over and over again. He had 35 carries, and I looked it up. I think he had 79 carries all of last year. Mm-hmm. So a very busy young man, but Coach Piron said that, he's a guy that he is, he's the most fit guy in the program, the most fit guy in the school. He runs track, and they told him, they're like, Nathan, you're going to get the ball a lot. And he did. 35 carries is quite a bit. In the first half, he had 20 carries. They had only had 4 position players touch the ball in the first half, and that's including their quarterback, Bodie Anderson. So they really rode Nathan Whitwell, and he had 3 touchdowns. He had a 52-yard touchdown right off the bat, kind of showing that track speed right off the bat, kind of beating guys down the left sideline. And then, finally at the end, Batavia's defense, really rose to the challenge, because Glenbard West, they pulled within a touchdown late in the third quarter. Glenbard West had 2 opportunities for a tying score. They got the ball twice on Batavia's side of the field. Batavia's defense, stood both times, turning away Glenbard West for a very good win. On the Glenbard West side, Tayon Oriental, their very fine senior running back. He had a couple touchdowns rushing. He had an 87-yard punt return for a touchdown. But really key for Glenbard West, he actually got hurt the second to last drive. He was dropped for a sack. They kind of threw him in at Wildcat. at quarterback, which they've done before. He got hurt on the second to last drive, and I talked to him after the game. Sounded like he had a hand injury, possibly maybe a little bit of a break, and he was going to the hospital. So that's something to keep an eye on. He's a very, very important cog for what Glenn Bard West wants to do going forward. So obviously it was a great game and a very good win for Batavia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously the big question was, what was the offense going to look like without Ryan Bowe? And obviously Nathan Whitwell did provide for the offense last year. I think he had 9 touchdowns for them on the ground last year. And he was overshadowed by, Charles Wellplay, who was, the main star of that offense besides Ryan Bowe. But I mean, he perfectly showed what he was capable of doing during that first game, especially against a team like Glenn Bard West. I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to run it with Whitwell in the coming weeks, especially with Bodie Anderson still trying to get used to the system and being still, getting used to the starting quarterback role. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they start to work Bodie Anderson in a little bit more into the action.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, I think they a lot of throws that Bodie Anderson threw was kind of like those wide receiver screens, short passes to Isaiah Brown and players like that. I think as the season goes on, you're going to see them open up a little bit more. And then by the end of the year, I mean, I think Nathan Wilton's going to be a huge part of what they do all year long. But I think by the end of the year, you're going to see a little bit more typical Batavia where they're opening up. They just do a really smart job of utilizing the talent at their disposal and how they utilize. I've always liked the way they do that on an offensive side, not to take away from defense. They always have a great defense as well. So a very good win for Batavia. Their kind of neighboring rival, Geneva, also opened with a kind of a resounding win. They weren't challenged to the same level Batavia was, but you were there on Friday. What did you see from Geneva?
I saw probably the longest first quarter that I have ever seen. I think it took 55 minutes for that first quarter to end, but rightfully so. I mean, there was so much that happened, and it was such little plays that happened. But Geneva only ran 9 offensive plays with their first team, and by the end of it, they were up 42-0. I mean, it was pretty crazy to see overall. I mean, big question was, how is Tony Chihino going to deal with the wide receivers and, getting thrusted into that starting quarterback role? And he did it pretty seamlessly. I mean, he was 6 for 7 passing. He had 164 yards and 4 touchdowns. There wasn't a single drive that Geneva had in the first quarter that lasted longer than 2 plays. I mean, it was just pretty dominant from the start. And they're going to be pretty fresh for this week as well, because they didn't play an entire 3 quarters. It was the second team playing the entire final 3 quarters against this Larkin team. But for the quarter that I did see, it looked like he had perfect control of the offense. I mean, he was slinging perfect balls to Talon Taylor and Finnegan Wepner. Both of them got all 6 of those receptions. And it looked like also Michael Romero, who is going to be the starting running back, also had some pretty solid runs as well, even if he did have 2 rushes. But it looked like that offense was just perfect cylinders throughout the entire time. And it's going to be very interesting to see as the season progresses, hopefully for more than a quarter.
Yeah, it's one of those games that's good for different guys to get on the field. A lot of guys got the opportunity to see what they can do. And in some cases, guys that have played before on varsity level. In other cases, guys getting their first varsity experience. So Geneva is going to get really tested down the road once they get into Duquesne Conference, but obviously a really good win for them starting the season. Game that I was at on Friday night, Oswego was hosting Equal Valley. Oswego, very impressive on both sides of the field. They come away with a 30-7 win. They forced 3 turnovers. Their defense was dominant. Carson Cooney, coach's son, going to Iowa, senior linebacker. He was all over the place, particularly in the second half. I think he had 7 tackles and 6 tackles for loss, and just all over the place, pressuring the quarterback, dropping guys in the backfield. Jeremiah Kane, Northern Iowa recruit, he had an interception. He had a long catch that set up a touchdown, and then he finally, caught a touchdown at the end of the game as well. And just, Oswego really controlled the game. They even won the game 30-7 with 2 touchdowns getting called back, to give you an idea about, how they're able to control the game. And they look like a team that's very experienced, that has big hopes for this year, because they are very experienced and they do have big hopes for this year. They have their coach, Brian Cooney, said they have 16 starters back from last year. He said that typically he's more like 10, 11 guys, but to have 16 guys back, they have 5 guys that started when they were sophomores, or at least they were up on varsity as sophomores, including his son, Carson Clutie, including Jeremiah Kane. Their senior quarterback, Brett Conley, he's another returning starter. He looked like a guy that, I mean, he had his ups and downs last year, but he looked like a guy really in control of things. He was kind of checking off plays that weren't there, just really a good grasp and really good poise. And I actually talked about that with him for my Kendall County football notebook. If you want to check it out, just his experience and how comfortable he is in the offense. He has pretty much all the same skill position guys back from last year. So Oswego looked really good, and they're going to be a team to watch in the Southwest Prairie Conference and in the Western Suburbs as a whole. So very good win for them. Another team that had a nice win, last Friday, a team from the Duquesne Conference that we're going to be talking about, St. Charles North. I mean, similar to last year, that was just a wild kind of shootout game at Palatine, and they come away with another win. If I'm not mistaken, I think Ethan Plum orchestrated like a 99-yard drive late in the game. So that's a really nice win for St. Charles North.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, we kind of expected it from last year's game between these two teams. I mean, it was a 37-34 victory for St. Charles North. And St. Charles North came back in that game, and they had to do the exact same thing this time around too, this time in enemy territory. I think they entered halftime down 24-14. And I mean, you kind of mentioned it there, a 99-yard touchdown drive led by Ethan Plum with a pass to Keaton Rinke in the end zone, and then a 2-point conversion at the end of it. I believe it was to Brian Harms, the Marmion transfer, who got that 2-point conversion to officially give them the win. So overall, a great game for St. Charles North. And I think Keaton Rinke, who caught that game-winning touchdown, had 3 touchdowns in that game, over 100 receiving yards. He was one of those guys that Coach Pomzak said was somebody to look out for. Obviously, he was injured last season, but with the large amount of senior wide receivers that they had, kind of was going to be a little bit overshadowed, was my guess. But this year, he has that full spotlight, that wide receiver number 1 spot, and he made sure to make his presence noticed in that first game. So that connection between the two will definitely be something to look forward to as they go through this next non-conference slate, and then eventually against Crete Monet, and then into Duquesne Conference play.
Yeah, good win for St. Charles North. Good weekend for the Duquesne Conference in general. They won, I believe, 7-1 in the conference, 7-1 in non-conference games. St. Charles East with the only loss, including in that Glenbard North that was winless last year. They got their first win right off the bat. And Wheaton North, similar to St. Charles North, they won at the end. They beat Providence on the last play of the game on a touchdown and a 2-point convert. Well, I know it's a touchdown. I'm not sure about the 2-point conversion. I think I'm confusing that with St. Charles North, but Wheaton North gets a good win, Glenbard North as well. So a very good weekend for the Duquesne Conference, who we think is going to be very good and showed it the first week. Another conference that we all know is going to be very tough is the CCL, ESCC, the Catholic League. Nazareth is a team that, prominent there in our area. Nazareth comes away with a really exciting win over Kankakee that was kind of a back and forth, came down to the end. Logan Malchik threw a touchdown, I believe, to Jake Sistone. So they beat Kankakee. Those two teams have played some very entertaining games, some very different games the last few years. Yeah, last Friday's game was a shootout. 2 years ago it was a 2-0 final. So we had a baseball score there. It wasn't a baseball score Friday, but nonetheless, Nazareth comes away with a very good win. And a team that we talked about it last week on the podcast, they started 0-4 last year. They started 2-4 the year before. They still won state, but nobody wants to get back in that situation where you're digging yourself back up. So a good start to the season for Nazareth. Nazareth there. A game that we kind of pinpointed last week, Joel, between two conferences and two teams that are very close to each other that hadn't seen each other for a while, was Glenbard East Willowbrook. I'm not sure if you saw it. That game was as wild a finish as any last Friday. Did you happen to see that?
Yeah, I saw a couple of good bits about it. I mean, it's very similar to St. Charles North. I mean, it came down to, and Wheaton North for that matter, came down to the last second, came down to the last drive. I mean, that 57-yard return from Monte Cook to set up that game-winning pass from Michael Neat and Mohammed Musle with 2 seconds left. I mean, you can't get any better than that. I mean, come on, it's week 1 of high school football, and you have a game-winning drive, game-winning touchdown. I mean, against two great teams, there's nothing better about it.
If people had missed it, there was 2 touchdowns in the game in the last 21 seconds. I mean, beat that. Willowbrook scores to go ahead, and their home fans are probably thinking, "Wow, this is an amazing Week 1 win over Glenbard East." And 21 seconds later, it's Glenbard East that's celebrating. So, wild game. If that's the way the season's going to go for those 2 teams, then buckle up. But a really nice win for Glenbard East, and a good win for the Upstate 8 Conference, being able to beat a West Suburban Conference. So a very good one there. Before we kind of look ahead to Week 2, there's a few more games that I wanted to kind of identify. Plano gets a nice 17-14 win over Ottawa. That was the debut of their new head coach, Kyle Tutt. I don't know if we talked about it last week. Interesting summer at Plano. Kyle Tutt, who used to be the head coach at Streeter, he was hired as an assistant in June. And then Rick Ponks, who is the Plano head coach, he took an assistant job at Benedictine University. And Kyle Tutt, he became the head coach in mid-July. I remember I showed up at a 7-on-7 in Canelan, and I went up to him and I said, "Hey, coach, how long have you been? You're pretty new, right? When were you named head coach?" He's like, "Yesterday." So I'm thinking, okay, but nonetheless, they get a nice 17-14 win at Ottawa. And really the story there, and again, I touched on my Kendall County notebook this week. Tim Young ran for 150 yards and a 75-yard touchdown. Tim Young was an offensive lineman before this year. His first 3 years of high school, he was a center for 2 years. He was a guard last year, but I asked him about it. I said, "How did you get moved?" Because normally you're thinking, maybe the coach is like, I had nobody or whatever. And he said, I went up to the coaches and I said, "I really think I'm a better fit for running back." He's a track guy, and he thought he's not that big. He's like 185, 190 pounds. And the coaches came together and they said, "All right, let's see what you got." He apparently has a lot. I mean, he ran for 150 yards and a touchdown. So a very good win for the Reapers, as they get ready for the Kishwaukee River Conference schedule ahead. Joe, before we kind of take a quick break and look ahead to Week 2, any other teams or games that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I got a couple that I think. Caneland was one of those teams that we were kind of keeping our eyes on, especially in that game against Washington. Of course, last year they lost that game in Michael Thorgenson's first game at head coach. This year, turned it around in enemy territory, got the 28-14 victory on the road. I mean, great start for the Caneland Knights in their second season under Michael Thorgenson. Yeah, it's a great way to start, especially with a new quarterback under center. Obviously, 4-year starter Troyer Carlson is no longer there. It's a great way to start off in a new era. Another team I kind of wanted to touch on, because I know we kind of mentioned it, while they were the one loss in the Duquesne Conference, I mean, St. Charles East kind of showed that their offense is pretty potent this year. They scored 40 points in their loss against a team that went 9-2 last year and made it to the second round of the playoffs in Lincoln Way Central. I think JT Padron, the new starting quarterback, had over 350 yards through the air and connected with Shiko Jokai, odd wide receiver, who had 169 yards and 2 touchdowns. So even though they got the loss, I mean, it shows how deep the Duquesne Conference is going to be this year, how deep the offense is going to be. And it's going to be really fun when it starts in 10 days.
No doubt. I saw that St. Charles East score, and I'm thinking, well, too bad they lost, but wow, their offense is pretty good. I mean, they're a team that once they start Duquesne Conference play, teams are going to be like, yeah, we think maybe we can beat St. Charles East, but man, they can really score. So we better, come ready for them. So, and then Canelan, you mentioned it. I mean, they graduated Troyer Carlson. They graduated Eric Johnson, who's a really good receiver, and some other guys. And they had a really difficult, what I thought was a very difficult start to the season before they even start Interstate 8 conference play, which is going to be a bear when you're talking about playing Washington, and then they got Wakanda this week. So that's a very good win for them right off the bat to kind of show that, hey, we're still pretty good. I mean, you may not know who we are, but you may not know some of these guys on our team, but yeah, we're still pretty good. So a really good win for the Knights.
Definitely, yeah. It's a great way to start off the season, especially to go have that 1-0 mentality every week. So to get that first one out of the way is definitely important.
All right. And when we come back, we'll look ahead to Week 2. Welcome back to the Friday Night Drive West Suburban podcast. Josh Welge. I'm here with Joel Boenitz. And Joel, as we look ahead to week 2, one of the matchups that kind of stands out, interesting matchup between teams from different leagues, and I don't think they played each other. Batavia hosting South Elgin. Batavia obviously coming off of a really good win over Glenbard West. South Elgin, they really had a tough one week 1. Barrington really kind of knocked them around, but Barrington's a very quality team. That's a Class 8A semifinalist from last year with a lot of kids coming back. But South Elgin's program, it's had maybe people don't really know, but they've had a lot of success the last few years. So I'm sure they're going to be, kind of preparing things. And that's not a gimme for Batavia week 2.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, kind of talking about it. Well, we kind of talked about, conferences and how well they did last week. The Upstate 8 East or the Upstate 8 West did not exactly have the best start to the new conference split up. I mean, I think they went 1-6 in total last week. The only team that got a win in that conference was West Aurora. So not the best start that you need before heading into conference play. But I mean, they still showed that South Elgin still showed that they had some quality players on the team. Big one, of course, being Ishmael George, who's playing tight end for them. He had 125 yards and all 3 touchdowns for South Elgin last week. So for Batavia, the real question is going to be, obviously they had to learn how to stop the rush in their first game against Glenbard West. The big thing this week is going to be how can they show that they can protect in the air. Obviously, they're returning a bunch of big defensive backs for them. Of course, big one being Chase Osborne, who's coming off of the season where he led the team in tackles. And then you also got guys like Jacob Jancy who can provide that backup as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how they can play against a team that primarily uses the air rather than using the ground like they did last week.
Yeah, Batavia was down one of their key defensive backs last week. Josh Cayley, I think you know the name. He didn't play, and Coach Pirani, he said he's one of our best, if not our best, defensive players. So I'm not quite sure the extent of his injury and how long he could be out, but really wasn't tested much. Glenbard West is not a team that puts it through the air a whole lot, but obviously that will be the case against South Elgin. And man, South Elgin, I talked about it last week how the Upstate 8 conference used to be, kind of a locked or closed conference where they just played each other, but now with the way that conferences has been sort of reconfigured, now they're able to step out and play non-conference games. Well, man, talk about stepping out, playing Barrington and Batavia back to back. That's really challenging yourself right off the bat. So yeah, we'll see what happens in that game with South Elgin Batavia. Another interesting matchup about with a couple teams that we know, one of them being from the Duquesne Conference, is Wheaton-Warrenville South hosting Lyons Township. Lyons Township, of course, their head coach, John Butcher, he was a great quarterback at Wheaton-Warrenville South back in the 90s, went on to play at Iowa and Illinois both. But both of these teams 1-0. Lyons Township, they got a really nice win over Prospect last week. Danny Carroll, their running back, really good game for them and really good win for them. They scored 38 points in that game. So that's a nice start. And Wheaton South, they were able to really handle Glenbard South, and really eye-opening game from a young man. I didn't know his name before last Friday. I'm talking about Owen York. He ran for over 200 yards in that game. So really nice game for him. Luca Carbonero, their quarterback as well. He had a nice game. So pretty good week 2 matchup, Lyons Township and Wheaton-Warrenville South.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I kind of mentioned it last week because I mentioned Wheaton-Warrenville South. I said that game was going to be a very important game for Wheaton-Warrenville South, and apparently they heard me and they stepped up to the challenge. I mean, that Owen York, Luca Carbonaro backfield is going to be very lethal for them in the future. And of course, going up against a huge football program like Lions is going to be another big test for them, especially heading into the Duquesne Conference, which seems to be a trend among a couple of these teams, facing off against some pretty good teams before heading into conference play. So it's going to be interesting to see.
No doubt. A couple other games that I'm kind of looking at for Friday night. One that I'm going to be at is York at Plainfield North. York was able to get a win last Friday in the head coaching debut of Don Gelsomino, who was their defensive coordinator prior to that. So they were able to beat Glenbrook South rather handily. On the other hand, Plainfield North, they lost a close one to Lockport, 28-21. Should be a good game. I'm kind of expecting it to maybe be low scoring, even though they both put up points the first week. Both of those coaches are defensive coordinators with a defensive background. So, Plainfield North usually has a lot of talent on the defensive side. Of course, York on the other side has Joseph Reif as a defensive lineman going to Notre Dame. So, really, really interested to see what York looks like with a new head coach, albeit a coach that was with the program already. And the other side, Plainfield North, I mean, similar to York, they have a very difficult conference ahead of them. And last year they just squeaked into the playoffs in 4-5. They obviously want to avoid an 0-2 start. So it should be a fun game. Looking forward to that one. York at Plainfield North. The other one, Oswego is hosting Joliet Catholic. That's a game that, Oswego, I was talking to head coach Brian Cooney this week, and I asked him, I'm like, how did you end up with Joliet Catholic? I mean, it's not like when you're scheduling games, you're like, you know what, week 2, let's just play Joliet Catholic. And he said they were looking for a week 2 game, and the options out there were limited, and they were limited some pretty big names. He mentioned that Glenbard West was out there, Lincoln Way East was out there, Loyola was out there, and they settled on Joliet Catholic. And that's a matchup that I asked Coach Kuhn, I said, when was the last time you guys played each other? And he didn't remember. He said that their former head coach, Carl Hoinkus, was there for a long time. He said, I bet Carl remembers. He said, I bet Carl remembers the exact date. And he thought maybe it was like 1990 or so when Mike Alstott was with Joliet Catholic. Mike Alstott went on to play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, was a very good NFL player. So that should be a fun one. Obviously, Oswego coming off of a big week 1 win, but then they played Joliet Catholic, who also had a nice one as well. So, that's a matchup that, man, I'm kind of seeing. Let's see what Oswego can do. I mean, they were pretty confident when I talked to those kids afterward that we know we had Joliet Catholic coming in, but we think we're pretty good too. And even Coach Cooney this week, he was pretty confident when I talked to him as well, that we're not just playing this game to play in. We're coming in here with a lot of confidence. So it should be a fun matchup. Joliet Catholic out of Oswego. What are some of the games you're looking at, Joel, this weekend?
There are a couple I'm looking at. I think the big one is going to be against, surprisingly enough, 2 0-1 teams, Glenbard West and Loyola. Those two are going to be matching up. Of course, you mentioned that they were 2 teams that didn't have, any matchups heading into week 2 originally. But I mean, both of these teams are coming off of some losses against some pretty big programs. Obviously, Loyola was the big one, losing to East St. Louis 35-7, I believe. Is that right?
It was pretty one-sided, and it snapped Loyola's 19-game winning streak, which went back a couple years.
Yeah. So it's definitely going to be a big bounce-back game for either one of these 2 teams. I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, you don't want to start 0-2, especially in a big league like this. So that's definitely going to be one to look out for. Another one also kind of touched on it a little bit already. Crete Monet and St. Charles North. I think that's going to be a big game for St. Charles North, just trying to see if they can get a more solidified win before they head into Duquesne Conference instead of a last second touchdown one, of course. And then another one as well is going to be Geneva versus Lamont. Lamont is obviously a little bit not as much of a big football team as they were a couple of years ago, but I think it's going to be a big game to kind of show if Geneva is more than just a 1-quarter team. And can see if they have, the depth and, of course, the stamina to play consistently throughout the entire game.
Yeah. You mentioned Lamont's not quite what they were a couple years ago, but I still think that they're a little bit step up in class from Larkin week 1 and another, as Geneva kind of eases their way into Duquesne Conference play. So yeah, that should be one to watch as well. So a lot of football coming up, a lot of things coming up on Friday Night Drive. I'm going to be back here tomorrow with Steve Soucie as we look ahead to week 2 around the state. JT Pedelti and Eddie Carifio and Drake Landsman, they will be coming at you later this week with a podcast looking at Northwest Illinois, DeKalb, Illinois Valley, Sterling, that kind of triangle. So that podcast as well. And of course, Friday night, please tune in back into our Friday night live stream, 9:30 to 11 p.m. Steve Soucie and Matt Rodewald with highlights, scores, guests from reporters, and they'll break down what it all means. So a lot to look forward to week 2. And you can look forward to week 2. We'll have our previews coming out, previews and picks coming out Thursday as well. So a lot of good stuff coming your way. And thank you very much for joining us. Joel, before we get out of here, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I was
pretty excited with week 1, and even more excited to see what happens in week 2.
Again, you can follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you choose to call it, at jwelge96. You can follow Joel. What's your Twitter handle? I don't have it in front of me, Joel.
J_Boenitz2. Most of the time, people, I say my last name and then everybody just says it wrong, so it's just easier to spell it out. So
I feel the same way. And of course, Friday Night Drive on Twitter at FN Drive. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Again, thanks for joining us, and you have a lovely Tuesday afternoon.